It's a whole brood of classics on NES Works episode 50. It's fitting, I think, for the 50th episode of this Chronicle of the US NES library to touch back on a game that helped establish its Japanese counterpart, the Famicom. After all, if the family computer hadn't been a huge hit to begin with, Nintendo might never have had the war chest to entrench itself in America. And certainly without the massive dedicated support of Japanese developers and publishers, most of the classics we associate with the NES would never have come into existence. The family computer enjoyed a fairly strong start back in 1983, but Nintendo stretched its internal resources pretty thin creating games to support the console. They often had to rely on outside contractors like HAL to bolster their output, and some of their early projects, such as the Robot series games designed to supplement the American NES launch, shipped seemingly incomplete. It was the support of third parties that helped the Famicom go from promising to powerhouse. Third-party publishing was a fairly new concept in the console market at the time. Activision had pioneered the concept on Atari 2600 in 1980, and Atari had adamantly resisted the encroachment of outside publishers onto its platform. The seal had been broken, though, and third-party software was inevitable. Nintendo wisely embraced its third parties as publishers in fairly short order. In fact, it collaborated with third-party Hudson to create a first-party accessory, the Famicom Basic Keyboard System, which launched about a month before Hudson shipped the very first third-party Nintendo release ever, Nuts and Milk. Other publishers quickly followed suit. Established powerhouses like Taito and Namco brought massive arcade hits to Famicom, and, perhaps more importantly, they brought the credibility of their sheer size and clout. Up-and-comers like Konami and Capcom found a home on Famicom too. And unlike on Atari, Coleco, and Sega platforms where ports were usually handled by outsiders, Famicom publishers typically handled these console conversions themselves, or at least oversaw the work under their choice of contractors. Famicom quickly became the destination for top-notch arcade conversions produced by the very studios responsible for those hits, a fact that allowed Nintendo to boast a kind of authenticity absent on rival platforms. These ports weren't always perfect, especially when Micronix was involved, but on the whole, Nintendo sat at the cutting edge of the industry in those critical days before the Famicom had ventured into other territories. And this was largely due to the contributions of third-party game makers. But third-party licensees weren't simply content to draw upon arcade works. Some companies, like Hudson and HAL, didn't have an arcade presence to speak of, having gotten their start on personal computers. While Famicom's early arcade conversions are probably best known, things like Tower of DRUAGA, 1942, and Elevator Action, many of its most critical early third-party titles came to the platform from computers. Some of these are practically mythic, like Enix's PORTOPIA RENZOKU SATSUJIN JIKEN, which directly paved the way for Dragon Quest. But the legacy of PC to Famicom releases goes all the way back to the beginning. The aforementioned Nuts and Milk was in fact a conversion of a game that had debuted on a slew of Japan-only personal computers. Over time, these PC to Famicom conversions became scarce as the platform itself evolved. Cartridges began to ship with onboard memory expansion modules that opened the door for more sophisticated works, and developers grew more canny and capable of exploiting the hardware's strengths and potential, resulting in original works unlike anything that had ever been seen on computers. Game Boy would offer one final chance for the vintage works of Japan's formative PC era to shine, but Famicom cheerfully left those days behind. Still, there was a small window of time in which publishers could sneak a few of their stronger computer properties into the market thanks to the sizable delay between the Famicom and NES launches and the relatively slow rollout of the NES across America. And it's here we come to publisher Brød's Nintendo debut toward the end of summer 1987 with Lode Runner and Raid on Bungeling Bay. Technically, the company was simply republishing two of the games that helped put it on the map in the first place, but there's a far more interesting story here than that, which helps explain why these versions of Lode Runner and Bungeling Bay are like strange funhouse mirror versions of the PC classics. Like Hudson and HAL, Brød had made its name as a computer publisher, although a closer analog to a Japanese company might be Enix. Brød began life as a publishing house for its founder's own creation, but its business model quickly shifted to focus on identifying promising creations by novice devs that the company could help fund and bring to market in exchange for a stake in that game's rights. Lode Runner and Bungeling Bay represented Brød's first entree into the console market, with conversions of its own properties. The original versions of these two games had been funded, co-developed, and published by Brød in 1983 and 84 respectively. meaning their console conversions were still somewhat timely when they hit NES in 1987. That said, outside of publishing, Brød had zero direct involvement with the design of either of these ports. Instead, both games had been licensed for Japanese Famicom release to Hudson, and Hudson handed their adaptations back over to Brød for a US NES publication. This rather tentative approach to bringing games to consoles hints at the future for Brød. Its forays into the console market would be rare, with a grand total of 8 NES games coming to the US under the company's imprint. Those 8 NES releases would account for roughly half of Brød's overall console output. Throughout the company's nearly 25 years of existence, it would stick almost exclusively to personal computers. Even for big-name multi-platform hits like Prince of Persia and MYST, Brød would only publish a handful of console adaptations itself, preferring to delegate that task to other companies. As a result, the Lode Runner and Raid on Bungeling Bay we received on NES were pretty dramatically different than fans might have remembered from those games' initial PC incarnations. Well, okay, Bungeling Bay wasn't that different. The biggest change this game underwent in its transition to NES was a modest visual upgrade. Designer Wright had restricted the visuals in the Commodore 64 version of Bungeling Bay to a palette of 4 total colors in order to speed up the action and take advantage of the platform's fast scrolling capabilities. Hudson didn't suffer from those limitations on NES, so the console port turned out to be a bit more vibrant than the original incarnation, though considerably less detailed. Otherwise though, this is a pretty decent rendition of a pioneering proto-strategy work. Hudson retained the mechanics and design of the original game on NES, including the entire map across which the game takes place. Raid on Bungeling Bay is somewhere between a strategy game and an overhead shooter, combining a fixed design with the dynamic CPU reactions to offer players a challenging and constantly shifting experience. In Raid on Bungeling Bay, you control a fighter craft tasked with single-handedly taking out enemy bases. These bases appear in fixed locations across the world, so you can plan a general strategy in advance. However, the enemy's defensive forces grow in ferocity as you take out their emplacements. In addition to launching strikes against bungling bases, you also need to be increasingly proactive about protecting the aircraft carrier that serves as your own base. Enemy fighters will scramble when you're spotted on radar, and they'll attempt to take down your jet and send your carrier to the bottom of the ocean. The game isn't totally necessarily lost if you lose the carrier, but it's much harder to complete the game without a handy place to repair damage and reload your base destroying bombs. Raid on Bungeling Bay isn't quite a masterpiece, but it's hard to overstate its influence and how much the medium would take from it. Its blend of combat and strategy would directly influence games like HERZOG ZWEI, which in turn inspired Westwood's Dune 2, which was essentially the genesis of the real-time strategy genre. Likewise, the game's dynamic difficulty would be echoed in the likes of Zanuck and ALESTE. Oh, and the guy who designed Bungeling Bay, the aforementioned Wright, would use this shooter as a springboard for one of the best-selling franchises of all time, SimCity. Wright found that the game he created was actually less entertaining than the tool he had designed to edit the map. So he began experimenting with the map tool, and 5 years later, he ended up with a civic management simulation called SimCity. Sadly, we users didn't get to enjoy Bungeling Bay's map editor, and SimCity would never quite make it to NES. Almost, but not quite. However, Brød's other NES debut title did include a map editor. Doug Smith's Lode Runner had become a smash hit on Apple II in large part because of its brilliant level design tools, and although Hudson did a lot to change the game en route to NES, they kept the map design system intact. In fact, this is one of the handful of Famicom titles that suffered in coming over to the NES. In Japan, Hudson's Lode Runner supported the Famicom Data Recorder cassette drive, an interesting little bit of synergistic happenstance. Hudson had developed the data recorder with Nintendo as part of the Famicom Basic expansion system, which again shipped in Japan a little while before this port of Lode Runner. Given the importance of Lode Runner's map-making system in its Apple II incarnation, Hudson naturally saw an important connection and gave their adaptation the option to record to and load from cassette. Fans could create their own Lode Runner masterpieces and save them to tape, and in theory could even swap them with friends. The NES port of the game keeps the level editor intact, but as the data recorder never shipped in the US, there's no way to keep maps once the console is powered down. User-made maps are ephemeral here, robbing Lode Runner of one of its most essential features. Well, that's probably overstating the case a little bit. Lode Runner on NES is still Lode Runner, even if you can't trade tape cassettes of your bafflingly impossible level designs with pals. The game looks a lot different here than it did on Apple II, of course. The original release of Lode Runner was about as colorful as the original Bungeling Bay, with tiny white stick figures running against a black background through a maze of blue bricks, white ladders, and yellow gold bars. Here, Hudson has made the whole thing massively cuter, bumping up the size of sprites and adding considerably more color to the whole thing. As a result, the levels no longer fit onto a single screen, they have to scroll left and right in order to accommodate the larger tiles. Although the NES's denser vertical resolution than the Apple II means the stage designs work out to be about the same height with no scrolling. Lode Runner on NES is also a considerably smaller game than the source material. On Apple II, Lode Runner shipped with no less than 150 stages, whereas here you only get a third of that. Well, that's a pretty hefty cut. These 50 stages are at least incredibly faithful to their corresponding mazes on Apple II. In effect, Hudson directly ported the first third of Lode Runner to NES, and it plays a lot more faithfully than it actually looks. As in Doug Smith's original release of Lode Runner, you control the eponymous hero who scrambles across a series of platforms and ladders in search of gold. Meanwhile, you're pursued relentlessly by a squad of monks, who here on NES are designed to be robots that look like Hudson mascot Bomberman, and they seek to catch the runner and prevent their gold from being heisted. It is, in effect, an exploration of the maze chase action genre popularized by PAC-MAN a couple of years before Lode Runner's debut, although it doesn't honestly play much like PAC-MAN outside of the fact that there are things chasing you in a maze. Instead, Lode Runner takes its cues from somewhat more formative works, namely Mindware's HEIANKYO Alien and Universal's Space Panic. As in those games, your on-screen avatar is largely defenseless and forced to deal with its pursuers indirectly. Rather than attacking them head-on, you instead dig holes in the ground that can temporarily trap your foes. This maneuver comes directly from HEIANKYO Alien, although here it's a secondary gameplay consideration. Whereas your entire goal in HEIANKYO Alien was to trap and destroy all the alien invaders, trapping in Lode Runner is a strategy that gives you a little breathing room as you seek to collect gold, which is your real goal. Unlike in HEIANKYO Alien, you can only dig. There is no option to cover up a hole. Instead, the holes self-seal after a few seconds. With the proper timing, you can cause a pit to seal itself over a robot pursuer. But even if you do, another robot will spawn into the maze to take its place. So really, digging has more value for navigation. You have the ability to leap into holes and drop through them to lower platforms, which can be a handy way to slip past pursuers. The robots are sort of smart in that they are aware of the player's on-screen position and will aggressively seek out the shortest route to the protagonist, even changing direction to cut you off. They're also kind of dumb though, and they'll run right into holes. They can wriggle themselves free after a moment, but no one bothered to program these guys to look down at their feet. It's sad. When a robot drops into a hole, it's rendered harmless until it manages to free itself. This becomes a critical tactical consideration. Many level strategies involve trapping a robot, then using its noggin as a makeshift platform to double back in the direction it came from. Unlike the robots, the Lode Runner lacks the ability to extricate himself from a pit. That said, simply falling into a temporary pit isn't instantly fatal. You can dig multiple consecutive pits, drop down into the resulting gulf, and get to work digging through the next layer down. There are a few limitations on how you dig, most notably the fact that you can only drill downward to the left or right of where you're standing, not straight down. But quickly burrowing down through a thick platform floor is an art that absolutely must be mastered here. Lode Runner plays pretty decently on NES, and it seems to have done reasonably well for itself in America. But in Japan, it was a landmark release. According to Tozai Games co-founder Scott Tsumura, whose relationship with Lode Runner stretches back 35 years, the Famicom owes a great deal of its early success to Lode Runner. That's not an unreasonable statement. Lode Runner had debuted on Apple II in the West only a year before it hit Famicom, meaning it was a fresh, new overseas import when it hit Japan. The Famicom version actually arrived slightly on the heels of a few other conversions of the game for Japanese PCs and IRIM's arcade adaptation. In other words, it was a home port of what appeared to be a hot, current arcade release. And unlike the PC renditions, it shipped on a system that cost about $150 rather than $1,000. Kids and adults in Japan alike wanted to play Lode Runner, and Famicom was by far the most affordable and attractive option in summer 1984. The Apple II version of Lode Runner reportedly sold about 250,000 units. The Commodore 64 adaptation managed similar numbers. Between Famicom and NES, however, Hudson's Lode Runner sold 3 times their combined numbers. It was a killer app for the system. That said, Lode Runner also benefited from great timing in Japan. The Famicom boom had just begun to transpire in earnest, with the console surging rapidly in popularity throughout late 1984. At the time, there were only a few dozen games available for the system, which meant the best Famicom releases were highly coveted by new console owners hoping to flesh out their libraries. And again, it certainly didn't hurt that its release fell so close to the debut of Famicom Basic and the data recorder, which gave both Hudson and Nintendo a handy cross-promotional tactic. Buy them both, save your Lode Runner creations. The idea of a stage editor was pretty new back in 1984, so this was a more compelling feature than you might expect. As a result of Lode Runner's explosive success on Famicom, it became a mainstay of the Japanese games industry in a way that very few other works of American origins ever have. I'd argue that only Wizardry and Ultima have come close, with maybe Undertale well on its way to that hallowed territory. Hudson followed up the Famicom release with another 50-level title based on the Experts Only Championship Lode Runner sequel, after which the Lode Runner console license passed over to IREM, who converted a bunch of their arcade-level designs into the Super Lode Runner duology for Famicom Disk System. None of these follow-ups made their way back over to the US on NES, beginning Japan's long legacy of exclusive Lode Runner ports, sequels, and spin-offs. The rights to Lode Runner bounced around through the years, occasionally even ending up back with Hudson for weirdo ventures like Cubic Lode Runner for GameCube. These days, the series belongs permanently to Tozai Games, an intellectual property management firm that continues to apply new concepts for the franchise, most recently with Lode Runner Legacy for Switch. Of course, all of that is a bit of a footnote to the NES release, and its companion raid on Bungeling Bay. Still, it's pretty interesting to see a major American PC publisher throw its hat into the ring for NES publishing. And the nature of these particular conversions, which were overhauled in Japan and served back to Americans, speaks volume about the nature and future of the NES. Next time on NES Works, there's actually more to say about IREM's conversions of arcade titles in American PC games.